It's Twitch Prime, brother. What's up, y'all? My name is OhDough, and recently I've been getting asked questions about what the different types of damage are in the game, and also about the colors of the damage. So I'll be explaining what stagger, wound, part, and basic damage are in this video, and I'll also give my top picks for the categories of those damage types. Now, we're going to go ahead and look at these in order, starting with Stagger Damage. So Stagger Damage is the blue text you see when doing attacks with certain weapons. And most weapons can do Stagger Damage except for Repeaters or the Ostian Yaeaters. They cannot do Stagger Damage, so keep that in mind. Anyway, Stagger Damage is basically a way of knocking behemoths unconscious if you do enough of it. And you'll know you're doing enough whenever a behemoth's face turns bubbly. When you see like these bubbles around its face, that means you're close to getting a stagger done. Now, a stagger is basically an interrupt. If you get a stagger off, you can interrupt a behemoth during an attack, during its aether form, during a couple of things. What you can't do for the most part is interrupt it during enrage, because even if you have bubbles on a behemoth whenever it goes in rage, it'll basically cleanse it to an extent or increase the threshold by a little bit, making it so after the enrage you can stagger it, but not during it. And for the weapons that do stagger damage, I'll go ahead and give a list of what I think does the most to the least. So hammer, axe, sword, chain blades, and then warpike, which I'm almost positive about the hammer, axe, and sword, but for warpike and chain blades, it could be, either one. But they're basically not going to do that much stagger damage overall, but they can get staggers. And repeaters, like I said earlier, do no stagger damage, so they're not on the list. The next damage type will be wound damage, which I actually like a lot in terms of the look of it, not so much the practicality, but the look of wounds is pretty nice. And wounds work in a similar fashion to stagger damage, except in this case, instead of hitting one part to contribute to a whole stagger, hitting one part for wound damage only contributes to wounding that one part, and that's it. And one thing to keep in mind is that once a part is broken, it cannot be wounded, and if it is wounded or was wounded, the wound goes away and cannot be reapplied to that part. And the funny part about wounds is that once you create one, the only real benefit you get is going to be increased part damage from all the weapons. And every weapon will get an additional 25% increased part damage done to that wounded part. And right now, the only weapon that does wound damage will be the warpike with its light attack, which is called a harvesting attack. Everything else must have a cell called acidic or barbed, which, by the way, I would highly recommend not using barbed and instead use acidic if you can. Because if you're going for wounds and your goal is not to break parts, then acidic will help you actually make wounds that last longer because your part damage will be cut in half, while also increasing your wound damage. Anyway, moving on to the next damage type, we will have part damage, which is a constant controversial topic for a lot of players because it can be confusing since it's called part damage when in fact it's actually not giving you any real damage. So sort of like how stagger damage and wound damage don't give you actual damage to a behemoth, part damage doesn't give you any actual damage either. Instead, it just gives you more part break potential. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. All part damage does is make you break parts faster. And breaking parts can help you kill behemoths by doing, stun-like animations, other things of that nature, but it does not contribute to the actual damage or DPS of a weapon directly. And this can be shown by running a full part damage build, which is using Bladestorm and Sharpened and the Ember main weapons, most of the sword, which by the way is probably the best weapon for breaking tails and horns because of the slashing bonus it gets. And for the weapons, my ranking for part damage will be the sword, repeaters, chain blades, axe, warpike, and then the hammer, because the hammer cannot cut tails or sever tails, and it can also not cut horns, which makes it really bad at breaking a lot of good parts you're going to need to upgrade some gear. And when you are using a build like this, you might notice some really big numbers like the yellow ones whenever you're doing certain attacks, but the funny thing is that those yellow numbers don't really mean much, because once you actually break the part you're hitting and you continue to hit that broken part, you will see that your white numbers or your white damage text is not even close to as big or anywhere near as big. And the reason for that is because part damage is not real damage. Real damage is what's underneath your part damage, which in some cases it's hard to calculate, but you can tell when a part's broken what your actual damage is versus the behemoth, because that will be your true damage, or in this case, your basic damage. Basic damage is done no matter what you are doing. If you hit a behemoth, you're doing basic damage. If you hit a behemoth part, you're doing basic damage. No matter what you do, as long as you're, hitting a behemoth to some degree, you're doing basic damage, and that is how you kill behemoths. And basic damage is the underlying factor in a lot of things. And the interesting thing is that if you increase your base damage, you'll also increase all the other damage aspects we've talked about so far. Increasing your base damage will also increase your wound, stagger, and part damage as well. which is kind of why cells like Sharpened, Bladestorm, Knockout King, Pacifier aren't meta, among other reasons, but mostly because you actually don't need them to, get more effectiveness out of using the weapons. You can get that by increasing your regular damage, such as going through cells like Rage Hunter, Overpower, Predator. Those kind of cells will actually increase the other factors of a weapon, making them more useful to you, while also increasing your regular damage and making you kill things faster. And I really want to take the time to clarify how these damage types are applied real quick. So stagger damage is done by hitting any body part, like the actual body parts, like the legs and the heads, but not the tail. Hitting the tail does not contribute to stagger damage, or hitting the, I would say, torso of a behemoth will not contribute to stagger damage at all either. Now, wound damage is done by hitting any part on a behemoth, and again, you cannot hit the torso of a behemoth because that will not count. It will give you basic damage, but it will not give you wound damage. You have to hit the legs, the horns, the head, the tail. Those will count. In some cases, behemoths will have sacks like on Charog. Those will count, but that is a very rare case, and most behemoths do not have something like that on them. Now, part damage works in the same way as wound damage to an extent, and that is, you have to hit the part to break it. And for wound damage and part damage, once the part's broken, you cannot wound it or break it again, unless you're fighting Koshai because it can regrow parts. But that is, that's not a common occurrence, that's just one behemoth that does that. So for the most part, once a part breaks, you cannot wound it or break it again. So long story short, try your best to hit the parts on a behemoth. Once you break a part, move on to a unbroken part. That's my suggestion. And now for my pseudo weapon tier list in terms of the most damage dealt. In terms of basic damage, I would say that hammer's number 1. Then I would rank either repeaters or sword are next. I'm not sure which one. Followed by the axe of the chainblades, which again, I'm not sure which one is better in terms of DPS. And in last place, you will have the warpike. So those are the damage types, and that is the damage legend, I guess, of Dauntless. And that's also the end of this video, guys. If you liked it, leave a like. If you want to subscribe to the channel for more Dauntless content. I can't say that fast. That's my rate for saying that, I guess. Anywho, if you guys like Twitch and you like watching live streams, be sure to drop me a follow because I do stream there pretty regularly every Wednesday through Saturday, 7 p.m. Central to 11 p.m. Central. And I'm a very interactive broadcaster. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, be sure to check out the links in the description down below. And y'all, thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.